Drop the bag. Now. The command cut clean through the rain, sharp enough to make a couple across the street pause mid-step, their umbrellas tilting as they turned to look. Officer Daniel Brooks stood under the flickering streetlight, one hand resting near his radio, the other holding a flashlight that cast a narrow beam straight toward the figure in front of him. The night air was heavy, the kind that clung to your skin, damp and cool, with the faint smell of asphalt and distant traffic humming like a low, constant breath. The woman didn't move right away. She stood there, small against the wide sidewalk, her coat a faded gray that had seen too many winters, the hem darkened by rainwater. Eleanor Hayes, 72 years old, though no one here knew her name yet. Her hand tightened slightly around the strap of the canvas bag resting against her hip, the fabric worn thin at the corners, as if it had carried the weight of years, not just things. The beam of Daniel's flashlight trembled just enough to catch the fine lines on her face, the quiet steadiness in her eyes. Not fear, not defiance, just something still. "Ma'am," I said, "drop the bag," Daniel repeated, his voice controlled, measured, the tone of someone used to being listened to. A police cruiser idled at the curb behind him, red and blue lights washing the wet pavement in shifting color, reflecting off puddles like fractured glass. Somewhere down the block, a car slowed, then kept going. The city never fully stopped, but moments like this made it hesitate. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. She didn't argue, didn't ask why. Instead, she lowered the bag gently to the ground, careful, almost deliberate, as if whatever was inside required more respect than the situation allowed. The soft thud of canvas against concrete sounded louder than it should have. Daniel stepped forward, boots pressing into shallow water, the faint splash echoing in the quiet. His radio crackled at his shoulder, a voice half-formed, then gone. He ignored it. His focus stayed locked on the bag, on her, on the instinct that had told him something about this wasn't right. Suspicious elderly woman. That was the call. That was all he needed. That was all he thought he needed. Eleanor's hands came to rest at her sides, fingers slightly curled from the cold, but steady. She watched him, not with challenge, not with submission, but with a calm that felt out of place under flashing lights. "You can open it," she said softly, her voice almost lost beneath the rain tapping against metal and pavement, but it carried, clear enough. Daniel paused, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause most people wouldn't notice. Something in the way she said it. No urgency, no edge, just certainty. The beam of his flashlight dipped toward the bag, illuminating the darkened seams, the zipper slightly off-center, a thread hanging loose near the handle. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his cap, sliding down past his jaw. Around them, the world held its breath, the sound of rain filling the space between heartbeats. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't look away. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Daniel felt the weight of that stillness press heavier than the badge on his chest as he reached down toward the bag, unaware that whatever he was about to find would not just answer a question, but rewrite the one he hadn't realized he was asking. Daniel's fingers hovered just above the zipper for a brief second, the kind of hesitation that did not belong to someone trained to act without doubt. But it was there, quiet and unfamiliar, like a thought that had not yet formed into words. The rain tapped steadily against the canvas, tiny droplets collecting along the seam before slipping down and disappearing into the dark fabric. He crouched slightly, the beam of his flashlight narrowing as it followed his movement, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The bag looked ordinary. Too ordinary. The kind of bag you would not notice in daylight, the kind people carried to work, to the grocery store, to places that did not require attention. And yet here it was, sitting between them like a question neither of them had asked out loud. Behind him, the cruiser lights continued their slow rotation, red folding into blue, blue dissolving into red, painting everything in shifting color that never settled. Eleanor remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, but her gaze steady, fixed not on the bag, but on him. Not watching what he would find, but how he would look when he did. Daniel pulled the zipper open halfway, the metal teeth separating with a soft, uneven sound that seemed louder in the quiet. He paused again, listening, though there was nothing to hear except the rain and the distant hum of a passing car several blocks away. His training told him to proceed, to check, to confirm. His instinct, the same instinct that had brought him here, pressed forward. He widened the opening and angled the flashlight inside. At first, all he saw was paper. Stacks of it, edges slightly curled from moisture, some bundled with thin rubber bands that had begun to stretch and loosen with age. He frowned, adjusting the angle of the light, expecting something else to reveal itself, something that would justify the stop, something that would make the report make sense. Instead, the top sheet shifted as a drop of water landed on it, the ink beneath catching the light just enough for a few words to become visible. "Thank you for your care." The letters were neat, deliberate, written in a hand that carried effort and sincerity. Daniel's grip on the flashlight tightened slightly. He reached in, careful without realizing why, and lifted the top bundle. The paper was thicker than he expected, not new, but preserved, each page carrying the faint scent of time, like something kept safe rather than used. Another line caught his eye as he turned the page just enough to read more. "You stayed with me when no one else would." His brow furrowed, confusion replacing certainty in small, quiet increments. This was not what he had prepared himself to find. Not even close. He glanced up briefly, just a flicker, and met Eleanor's eyes. She did not speak. She did not move. But there was something in the way she stood there, in the way she had said "you can open it," that made the moment stretch longer than it should have. Daniel looked back down, the weight of the papers in his hand suddenly heavier than their size could explain. Another bundle rested beneath the first, edges marked with different handwriting, different ink, different years. He swallowed, the motion subtle, almost instinctive, as if his body was adjusting to something his mind had not yet accepted. The rain continued to fall, steady and indifferent, but the space between them had shifted. What had begun as a routine check now felt like the edge of something else, something he could not yet name, but could already feel pressing in, quiet and undeniable, as he reached back into the bag to see what else had been carried all this way. Daniel's hand moved deeper into the bag, slower now, as if the air itself had thickened around him, each motion deliberate in a way he had not intended but could no longer ignore. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly as it followed his hand, catching more pages, more ink, more voices that had been folded and carried, preserved instead of forgotten. He pulled out another stack, this one bound tighter, the rubber band still holding firm despite the years it had likely endured. The edges were uneven, some pages thicker, others thin and worn, like they had been read more than once, maybe dozens of times. He flipped the top page carefully, mindful of the rain, though he had not realized when that instinct had changed from searching to protecting. The words were different this time, written in a sharper hand, more urgent, less polished, but no less sincere. "You told me I was not alone when I thought I was." He exhaled quietly, the sound lost beneath the steady rhythm of water hitting pavement, but he felt it in his chest, a subtle shift that did not belong to procedure or protocol. His eyes moved across the page, then to the next, each line carrying a different voice, a different story, yet all anchored to the same name. Nurse Hayes. He had heard the name before, or maybe he had not. It hovered somewhere just out of reach, like a memory that refused to surface when called. He lowered the papers slightly, the light drifting across the inside of the bag again, revealing something beneath the stacks, something that caught the beam differently. Not paper, not fabric, metal, a dull glint beneath the layers, partially hidden, as if it had been placed there last, or perhaps first, the way people store what matters most at the bottom, where it cannot be easily disturbed. Daniel hesitated, then set the papers back down inside the bag with more care than he had used to open it. His fingers brushed against the metal object as he reached for it, cool even through the dampness, solid in a way the papers were not. He lifted it slowly into the light, the shape becoming clearer as the beam steadied. A metal, not polished, not new, but worn in a way that spoke of time rather than neglect. The ribbon attached to it had faded, its colors softened, but still visible beneath the dim glow. He turned it slightly, the engraved surface catching just enough light for the letters to emerge, one by one, as if revealing themselves reluctantly. Eleanor Hayes. The name settled into the space between them, heavier than anything else he had pulled from the bag. Beneath it, smaller text, but clear enough. 40 years of service. Daniel's jaw tightened, not in resistance, but in something closer to realization, though it had not fully formed yet. He stared at the metal a second longer than necessary, then glanced up again, this time holding the look. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, her face unchanged, her eyes steady, carrying a depth that did not demand recognition but did not hide from it either. Around them, the rain continued its quiet persistence, the streetlights casting long reflections that stretched and broke across the wet ground. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly, then faded, swallowed by the night. Daniel swallowed again, the motion slower now, heavier. The call he had responded to felt distant, almost irrelevant, like something that had belonged to a different moment entirely. The metal rested in his hand, its weight undeniable, its presence shifting the ground beneath everything he thought he understood about what he was doing here. And for the first time since he stepped out of the cruiser, the certainty that had guided him began to crack, not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly, like something inside him recognizing that this was no longer about suspicion, but about something he had not been prepared to face. Daniel kept the metal in his hand longer than necessary, his thumb brushing lightly over the engraved letters as if they might change under his touch, as if there was still a version of this moment where it meant something else, something simpler, something that fit the report he had answered minutes ago. The rain softened for a brief second, then returned, steady and patient, tapping against his sleeve, the bag, the ground, like a rhythm that refused to rush. He lowered the metal slightly, not putting it back, not holding it up, just letting it exist between them, suspended in a space that no longer felt controlled by him. "You worked in a hospital," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, the edge gone, replaced by something less certain, something closer to a question than a command. Eleanor nodded once, slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving his. "A long time," she replied, her voice steady, carrying no need to explain more than that. Daniel glanced down at the bag again, at the stacks of letters, the careful way they had been kept, the way each one had been preserved like it mattered, like it had weight beyond ink and paper. "These people wrote to you," he said, though it was obvious, the words coming out anyway as his mind tried to catch up with what his hands had already uncovered. "Some did," she answered, her tone calm, not dismissive, but not inviting more either. The cruiser lights behind him continued to pulse, but they felt distant now, less like authority and more like background noise, something that belonged to a different version of this moment. A figure stood across the street, phone lowered now, no longer recording, just watching, the curiosity replaced by something quieter, harder to name. Daniel shifted his weight, the water beneath his boots rippling outward in small circles, breaking the reflection of the streetlight into fragments. He looked at Eleanor again, really looked this time, noticing details that had been invisible before, the slight tremor in her fingers not from fear but from age, the way her coat had been mended at the sleeve, careful stitches, done by hand, the way she stood not as someone caught, but as someone who had simply been stopped. "Why are you carrying all this?" he asked, the question coming out softer than he intended, stripped of authority, shaped more by confusion than suspicion. Eleanor's gaze shifted for the first time, not away, but downward, toward the bag, toward the letters, toward the metal in his hand. The pause stretched, not uncomfortable, but full, like something being chosen rather than avoided. "Because they asked me not to forget," she said quietly, her voice threading through the rain without needing to rise above it. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, subtle but undeniable, a pressure that did not belong to the cold or the moment, but to something deeper, something that had been there longer than he realized. He looked back at the metal, then at the letters, then at her, the sequence repeating in his mind as if trying to align pieces that had never been meant to fit together this way. The call, the report, the assumption, they all felt thinner now, like paper left too long in the rain. "I thought," he started, then stopped, the rest of the sentence dissolving before it could form, because whatever he thought no longer held the same weight. Eleanor did not respond. She did not fill the silence. She simply stood there, allowing it to exist, allowing him to sit in it, to feel it, to understand it without being told. The rain continued, softer now, almost steady enough to disappear into the background, but it was still there, marking time, washing the pavement, blurring the sharp edges of the night. Daniel took a slow breath, the air cool in his lungs, grounding in a way that felt unfamiliar. The badge on his chest felt heavier than it had before, not because it had changed, but because he had. And as he stood there, holding a medal that spoke of decades he had not witnessed, surrounded by words he had not read until now, the distance between who he thought he was in this moment and who he actually was became impossible to ignore. Daniel slowly lowered the medal back toward the open bag, but he did not release it right away, his fingers lingering as if letting go would mean admitting something he was not ready to put into words. The rain had softened into a fine mist, barely visible now, but still settling over everything, coating the letters, the pavement, the silence between them. He finally placed the medal gently on top of the papers instead of burying it beneath them, an unconscious shift that spoke louder than anything he had said so far. His hand stayed there a second longer, resting against the edge of the bag, before he pulled it back. The motion felt heavier than it should have, like lifting something unseen. "I should not have stopped you like that," he said, the words coming out low, measured, but different from before, stripped of command, carrying weight instead of authority. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it did not need to be. Eleanor did not respond immediately. She watched him, the same steady gaze, but now there was something else behind it. Not approval, not judgment, just recognition, as if she had heard words like that before, or maybe had waited a long time to hear them from someone like him. "You did what you believed was right," she said after a moment, her voice calm, almost gentle, not excusing, not condemning, just placing the truth where it belonged. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in defense, but in acknowledgement. That was exactly the problem. He had believed he was right. The thought settled deeper than he expected. He glanced down at the bag again, then at the scattered droplets forming along the edges of the papers, tiny circles spreading slowly across the ink. Without thinking, he reached down and adjusted the top layer, shielding it slightly from the rain, his movements careful, almost protective now. The shift did not go unnoticed. Across the street, the bystander who had been watching took a small step back, lowering their gaze, the moment no longer something to capture, but something to respect. Daniel straightened, his shoulders rising and falling with a slow breath, the kind that came when something inside had shifted but had not fully settled yet. "Is there somewhere you need to be?" he asked, the question simple, but the tone different, no longer interrogating, but offering space instead of taking it. Eleanor looked past him briefly, toward the dim outline of the street stretching ahead, then back at him. "Just home," she replied. "It is about 4 blocks from here." Daniel nodded, his eyes following the direction she had glanced, the wet pavement reflecting faint streetlights that flickered at uneven intervals. 4 blocks. In another moment, another version of this night, that distance would have meant nothing to him. Now it felt longer than it should. He bent down again, this time with intention, and carefully closed the zipper of the bag, aligning it properly, making sure no paper was caught in the seam. The small act carried a quiet weight, a correction not just of the bag, but of something larger. He lifted it slightly, testing the weight, then held it out toward her with both hands, not casually, but deliberately, as if returning something that mattered. Eleanor accepted it without hesitation, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second, warm despite the cold air, steady despite the years. Daniel stepped back, creating space where before he had closed it. The cruiser lights continued behind him, but they felt distant now, almost out of place in the stillness that had settled between them. He reached up and clicked his radio, the soft static filling his ear. "Dispatch, situation resolved," he said quietly. No explanation, no justification, just an ending. The response crackled back, routine, unaware that anything had changed. But something had. As he lowered his hand, watching Eleanor adjust the strap of her bag over her shoulder, he realized that the weight he had felt earlier had not disappeared. It had simply moved, settling somewhere deeper, somewhere that would not be as easy to ignore the next time he thought he already understood what he was looking at. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. The space between them held steady, no longer sharp with tension, but not empty either. The rain softened further, thinning into a light drizzle that barely made a sound as it touched the pavement, leaving behind a faint shimmer under the streetlights. Eleanor adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, the fabric settling against her coat as if it had always belonged there, as if nothing had been disturbed. Daniel remained where he stood, hands at his sides now, no longer reaching, no longer directing, just present in a way that felt unfamiliar to him. The hum of the city returned slowly, a car passing at the end of the block, tires cutting through shallow water, a distant door closing somewhere out of sight, life continuing in quiet fragments. Eleanor took a small step forward, then another, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accepted the moment for what it was and moved beyond it without needing to hold on to it. Daniel watched her, his eyes following the rhythm of her steps, the way her figure moved through the soft glow of the streetlights, each pool of light briefly outlining her before letting her fade into shadow again. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to say something, but no words came, or perhaps none felt necessary. Instead, he took a slow breath, the cool air filling his chest, grounding him in a way that felt different from before, quieter, more deliberate. The cruiser lights behind him continued their slow rotation, but he reached back without looking and switched them off. The sudden absence of color left the street in a natural darkness, softer, more honest, the reflections on the pavement settling into stillness. Eleanor paused briefly at the edge of the next block, not turning fully, just enough that her profile caught the light. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, offer a final word, but she did not. She simply inclined her head once, a gesture so small it could have been missed, then continued walking. Daniel stood there, the silence stretching, but no longer uncomfortable. His hand brushed lightly against the front of his uniform, over the badge that now felt different against his chest, not heavier, not lighter, but clearer, as if its meaning had shifted in a way he had not been taught, but had just begun to understand. He looked down at his hands, still faintly damp from the rain and the bag he had held, and for a brief moment, he noticed the absence of urgency, the absence of that instinct that had driven him just minutes ago. It was not gone, but it had changed, shaped by something he could not ignore anymore. The street ahead remained quiet, the kind of quiet that did not demand attention but invited reflection. Daniel turned slightly, glancing back at the path Eleanor had taken, her figure now smaller, nearly blending into the dim outline of the block beyond. He did not follow. He did not need to. Instead, he stood there a moment longer, letting the stillness settle fully, letting the weight of what had shifted find its place. Then, slowly, he turned back toward his cruiser, his steps measured, the sound of his boots against the damp pavement steady and even. The night had not changed, the city had not changed, but something within him had, quiet and undeniable, like a line drawn that could not be unseen, guiding every step that would come after this one. Daniel reached the driver's side door, but did not open it right away, his hand resting on the handle as if the simple act of getting back inside would close something he was not ready to leave behind. The metal felt cold against his palm, grounded, real, unchanged, unlike the quiet shift still settling inside his chest. He looked up once more, instinctively, his gaze tracing the direction Eleanor had taken, but she was no longer clearly visible, just a faint silhouette dissolving into the dim stretch of the block, her figure blending into the rhythm of the city that had already moved on. He exhaled slowly and opened the door, sliding into the seat with a measured motion, the interior of the cruiser wrapping around him in familiar structure, dashboard lights steady, radio low, everything exactly as it had been before he stepped out, and yet not the same at all. He closed the door, the sound soft but final, and sat there for a moment without starting the engine, his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead but not really seeing the street anymore. Instead, his mind replayed fragments, not the call, not the protocol, but the details he had missed at first glance, the worn stitches on her sleeve, the careful way she had lowered the bag, the calm in her voice when she said, "You can open it," as if she already understood something he had not yet learned. He reached toward the center console and picked up his small notepad, flipping it open to the blank page where he would normally jot down details, descriptions, anything that might matter later. The pen hovered above the paper, but no words came. What would he even write? Suspicious elderly woman. That no longer made sense. He closed the notepad again, slower this time, setting it back down as the realization settled deeper, quiet but firm. The radio crackled softly, a routine update passing through, another call somewhere else, another situation waiting, the city continuing its endless cycle of urgency and response. Daniel listened, but only halfway, his attention caught between what he was hearing and what he had just experienced. He reached for the ignition, paused, then instead leaned back slightly in his seat, his eyes drifting to the rearview mirror. For a brief second, he saw only the empty street behind him, wet pavement, dim lights, nothing unusual. Then, as the angle shifted, he caught a faint reflection of movement at the far edge of the mirror, Eleanor crossing under a distant streetlight, her figure small but steady, continuing forward without hesitation. Something in his chest tightened, not with urgency, not with obligation, but with recognition, the kind that does not demand action, but leaves a mark that does not fade. He straightened slightly, his hand finally turning the key, the engine coming to life with a low hum that filled the quiet space. The dashboard lights brightened, the systems resetting, everything returning to function as expected. But as he adjusted the rearview mirror again, the reflection was gone, replaced by darkness and the faint glow of streetlights stretching into the distance. He sat there a second longer, letting that absence settle, understanding in a way he had not before that some moments do not stay visible, but they stay with you anyway. He shifted the cruiser into drive, easing forward slowly, the tires rolling over the damp pavement with a soft, steady sound. The city opened up ahead of him, streets branching, lights flickering, life continuing in all directions. But his grip on the wheel felt different now, less rigid, more aware, as if every decision from this point on would carry the echo of what he had just learned. And somewhere beyond the next block, beyond the reach of his headlights, a woman carried her memories forward, not needing acknowledgement, not waiting for validation, just continuing, as she always had, while behind her, a man sat with the quiet understanding that the line between authority and humanity was not as clear as he once believed. The cruiser rolled forward at a slow, deliberate pace, headlights cutting through the damp air, illuminating the empty stretch of road ahead in a soft, steady beam. Daniel kept his speed low, barely above 10 miles per hour, not because the road demanded it, but because something in him did. His hands rested on the wheel, firm but no longer tense, his fingers adjusting slightly with each subtle turn, as if he were relearning the motion rather than repeating it. The windshield wipers moved in a quiet rhythm, left to right to left, clearing the thin layer of mist that kept forming between each pass. He glanced once more at the side mirror, not expecting to see anything, but still checking, still aware. Nothing. Just the reflection of streetlights trailing behind him like fading echoes. He turned the corner at the end of the block, the tires making a soft arc over the wet pavement, and for a brief moment, he considered continuing on, letting the night carry him to the next call, the next report, the next version of certainty. But his hands slowed on the wheel, almost imperceptibly, and instead of accelerating, he eased off the gas and let the cruiser drift toward the curb. The engine idled as he sat there, the quiet hum filling the space again, familiar but no longer enough to drown out what lingered in his thoughts. He looked ahead, then down at his hands, then back up again, the motion small but repetitive, as if grounding himself in something simple. The street was nearly empty, a porch light glowing faintly across the road, a mailbox standing still at the edge of a lawn, the ordinary details of a neighborhood that did not know what had just shifted a few blocks behind. Daniel exhaled slowly, then reached for the gear shift and moved it into park. For a moment, he just sat there, listening to the engine, the wipers, the faint drip of water from the edge of the roof. Then he made a decision that did not come from protocol, not from training, but from something quieter, something that had been forming since he first opened that bag. He shifted back into drive, turned the wheel, and made a slow U-turn, the headlights sweeping across the street, briefly illuminating the sidewalk, the trees, the empty space where nothing seemed different, and yet everything felt changed. He guided the cruiser back in the direction he had come from, not rushing, not chasing, just moving with intention. As he approached the block where he had stopped her, he slowed again, his eyes scanning the sidewalk, the corners, the spaces between the pools of light. Then he saw her. Eleanor was farther down now, nearly at the next intersection, her pace unchanged, steady, unhurried, as if the night belonged to her just as much as anyone else. Daniel pulled the cruiser to the side and stopped again, the engine idling softly. He did not step out immediately. Instead, he watched for a second, the way she moved, the way she carried the bag now resting securely against her shoulder, the same bag that had shifted something in him without asking permission. Then he opened the door and stepped out, the cool air meeting him again, the quiet of the street settling around him. He did not raise his voice. He did not command. He simply walked forward a few steps, closing some of the distance, but not all of it. "Ma'am," he called gently, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach her without breaking the calm of the night. Eleanor paused and turned slightly, her figure catching the edge of the streetlight once more. Daniel stopped where he was, leaving space between them, his posture open, no longer blocking, no longer directing. "It is late," he said, the words simple, but chosen with care. "Let me make sure you get home safe." The offer hung there, not imposed, not expected, just given. Eleanor looked at him. For a moment, her expression unreadable at first, then softening just enough to show understanding, not surprise, not relief, but recognition of the shift that had brought him back. She adjusted the strap of her bag again and gave a small nod, the same quiet gesture as before, but this time it carried something more. Daniel did not move closer right away. He simply matched her pace as she turned and continued walking, a few steps behind and to the side, not leading, not following too closely, just present. The street stretched ahead of them, quiet, steady, lit by spaced-out lamps that cast long shadows across the pavement. And for the first time that night, the distance between them was no longer defined by suspicion or authority, but by something simpler, something harder to name, and far more difficult to forget. They walked without speaking for a while, their footsteps falling into a quiet rhythm against the damp sidewalk, the sound soft and steady, blending with the faint hum of the city settling into the late hours. The streetlights stretched ahead in long intervals, each one casting a circle of pale light that they stepped into and out of, shadows forming and dissolving with every few yards. Daniel kept his distance, not out of hesitation, but out of respect, matching her pace without needing to adjust it, letting the silence remain undisturbed. Eleanor's posture stayed the same, upright but relaxed, her movements measured, familiar with the path she had likely walked countless times before. The bag rested securely against her side, no longer something questioned, just something carried. As they reached the corner of the next block, Eleanor slowed slightly, her gaze shifting toward a small house set back from the street, its porch light glowing warm against the cool night. The lawn was modest, the walkway narrow but clean, leading up to a front door that had seen years of use, the paint slightly worn near the handle. She stopped at the edge of the walkway, turning just enough to face Daniel, the light from the porch catching the lines of her face more clearly now, revealing not just age, but history, the kind that did not need explanation. Daniel stopped. As well, a few feet away, his hands resting loosely at his sides, no longer searching for something to do. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them held a quiet understanding, something that had formed without being named. "This is where I live," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying the same calm it had from the beginning, unchanged by everything that had passed between them. Daniel nodded once, the motion simple, but deliberate. "Thank you for letting me walk with you," he replied, the words chosen carefully, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Eleanor's eyes held his for a brief moment longer, and there was something there, not approval, not forgiveness in any grand sense, but something steadier, something closer to acknowledgement. "You already did more than that," she said quietly. Daniel felt the weight of those words settle, not heavily, but firmly, like something placed exactly where it needed to be. He did not respond right away. He did not need to. Instead, he gave a small nod, the kind that carried understanding without requiring explanation. Eleanor adjusted the strap of her bag once more, then turned toward the walkway, her steps unhurried as she moved toward the front door. The porch light cast a soft glow around her, outlining her figure as she reached the steps, her hand brushing lightly against the railing before she climbed up. Daniel remained where he was, watching only for a moment, not out of concern, but out of quiet respect for the end of something that had not begun the way it should have. Eleanor reached the door and paused, her hand resting on the handle. For a brief second, she looked back over her shoulder, not fully turning, just enough for her voice to carry across the short distance. "Good night, officer," she said. The words were simple, but they held no edge, no distance, just a calm finality. Daniel straightened slightly, the title sounding different now, not as something that separated them, but something he would have to carry differently from this point on. "Good night, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady. Eleanor gave a small nod, then turned back, opening the door and stepping inside. The light from within spilled briefly onto the porch, warm and steady, before the door closed softly behind her, the sound quiet but complete. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, the night settling back into its natural rhythm, the streetlights humming faintly, the air cool and still. He looked down the empty street, then back at the house, now still, unchanged from the outside. Then he turned, walking back toward his cruiser with measured steps, each one carrying a quiet awareness that had not been there before. As he reached the door and paused, his hand resting on the handle once more, he took a slow breath, the kind that marked not an end, but a beginning that did not need to be announced. He got in, started the engine, and pulled away, the headlights stretching forward into the night, leaving behind a house, a woman, and a moment that would not follow him in sight, but would remain, steady and clear, guiding him long after the street itself had disappeared from view.